How much more can we take? This was a question that was asked in a recent USA Today article about everything that's going on in our world right now. How much more can we take? It's a question that captures the overall exhaustion that I think we're all starting to feel, if we haven't been feeling it already. I know I've spoken to many of you on the phone, and I can just tell by what you tell me and through the sound of your voice that exhaustion is a reality in our world in this moment. It's an exhaustion that comes from all the demands that are being placed on us right now. See, we're almost a full year into this pandemic. We're 11 months since the time we had to close this place of worship down for in-person worship. It's been almost a full year, and it's been a year when we've really lost a way of life. We've lost the ability to meet up with friends the way that we like to. We've lost the ability to go to school and to go to work in ways and in systems that we know. We've lost the ability to do major rituals like weddings and graduations and funerals. And we've even lost lesser rituals. Things like going to the gym on a daily basis, going to coffee shops to work, going to do the mundane things that we take advantage of throughout the day that we see when they're removed, how important they are in our lives. Add on to all this, add on to the Zoom calls and the virtual schools, add on to all this the political division that we are experiencing, the constant delivery of emotional news and the constant scenes of violence on the news. Add to that the experience of death that is all around us. Over 400,000 lives have been lost in this pandemic. And it's something I don't think we've fully reckoned with as a society. I think it's going to be something like a slingshot where we're moving ahead and it's going to come back to get us. We're going to have to reckon with the loss of life in our society at some point. And now, this is not to mention all the domestic responsibilities that we have in our everyday lives, things that we're charged with just doing on a regular basis, things that when you're facing everything else can become this huge burden. Things as simple as checking your email because you know once you open up that email inbox, somebody's going to be asking you to do something. Things like just paying a bill. What might have just been a simple task turns out to be some monumental thing when we're exhausted. See, in this world that we're living in, it feels like we are constantly having to give ourselves, to pour ourselves out. And sometimes we keep ourselves busy by personal choice. How we're constantly on the go for others, or giving for others, or taking on more than we can chew because we think it's the right thing to do. How much more can we take? See, once we reach a certain point of exhaustion, once we've poured everything out of ourselves, once we've given all that we can and even more, see, it starts to get dangerous. Dangerous to ourselves, both mentally and physically, and dangerous to those around us. See, what happens is we make one of two choices. We either start to retreat inwardly in an unhealthy way, and it's a time where depression and anxiety can eat away at us. I also think that this is a lot of a source of our illness, is that when we retreat inwardly and because we're so exhausted, our bodies actually take that in and start to break down. Our minds start to break down and our bodies start to break down. So we either retreat inwardly in an unhealthy way, or we start to lash out. We take it outward. We lash out irrationally. We take it out on others. Have any of you found yourselves snapping at your loved ones for no reason, really? And we're around each other more and more. We're not able to escape. And so sometimes we can just, out of our exhaustion, just snap at somebody that we really love. We say something or we do something that we wouldn't normally intend to do or say. See, it's dangerous to pour out more than we have stored up in our tanks. And that's why I look at our scripture reading today and I worry about Jesus. I worry about Jesus because so far in this first chapter of Mark, if you've been following along with us, we see that he is constantly on the go. He's traveled from Nazareth in Galilee to the Jordan River in order to be baptized by John the Baptist. He was then ushered into the wilderness right after his baptism, where he fasted from food and water for 40 days, where he also was tempted by Satan himself. Then, after being in the wilderness, he appears along the Sea of Galilee, where he had to travel to get to the Sea of Galilee. And this is where he calls his first 4 disciples. And together they travel to Capernaum, where Jesus immediately starts teaching and casting out unclean spirits. That's where we left off last week. See, Jesus has been on a whirlwind tour of Galilee. And this tour is just beginning. In our scripture reading today, we finally see that Jesus makes it to a domestic residence, a house, a home, the home of Simon and Andrew. And there, once he arrives, rather than being offered a place of rest, a place of respite, a place to get away, he's immediately confronted and called on to heal Simon's mother-in-law. Not exactly a break. And alongside that, we also see that Jesus' popularity is starting to escalate quickly. Going into Capernaum, nobody knew who Jesus was. Jesus was a nobody that just appeared out of nowhere. But after commanding the unclean spirit out of the man at the synagogue in Capernaum, his fame began to spread throughout Galilee. And suddenly, while Jesus is still at Simon and Andrew's house, along with James and John, Mark says the whole city of Capernaum was gathered around their door, and everyone who was sick or possessed was brought to Jesus for healing and to have demons cast out of them. And Jesus did, in fact, heal many of them and cast out demons from many of them. Now, if you really think about it, that's a lot of pain and trauma that Jesus is being forced to confront. He's constantly being asked to give and to give and to give. Along with that, he's traveling a lot and he's pouring a lot out of himself. And I have to ask, how much more can Jesus take? How much more can he take? But the interesting thing is that we never hear Jesus ask that question. In fact, to quote a popular deodorant company, we never even see him sweat. Something is supporting and sustaining Jesus. Something is giving Jesus the ability to persist amidst the chaotic whirlwind that he's living in. And I think we get a glimpse of it here in this verse 35. Verse 35, Mark says that in the morning, while it was still very dark, he, meaning Jesus, got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. In the early morning hours, before the rest of the world was awake, Jesus peeled himself out of bed, tiptoed out of the house to a place where no one was around, where no one could find him, and he prayed. Now let's unpack this a little bit, because I think it speaks to how we as individuals now can deal with the exhaustion and even the trauma that so many of us are experiencing and so many of us will face. First thing that Mark writes is that Jesus got up. He got up. And even though I'm sure Jesus was tired and worn out, he got up. I remember a couple of weeks into the pandemic, I think it was towards the end of March, I remember that I just crashed. Maybe many of you had the same experience, but once the church shut down, it was like I got this rush of energy. I read an article about it being called a surge capacity, where when something happens, when some kind of chaos happens, when a disaster happens, we go into this thing called surge capacity, where we get a rush of energy in order to survive it. Well, I got that surge capacity. I got that rush. I started to get really busy trying to produce content that we could take in. If you remember, it was right towards the beginning of Lent. We had Easter on the horizon. And so I wanted to produce content that we could take in and make Lent important, and also give us something to do around the house while we were shut in. But that initial surge of energy could only last for so long. 2 weeks into our shutdown, my body was shutting down itself. See, virtual school wasn't going well. Virtual preschool, I should add, wasn't going very well. We kept having, if you remember, a series of false deadlines. Oh, we're going to be back in 2 weeks. Oh, we'll be back by Easter. Oh, we'll be back by spring. Oh, we'll be back by June. We kept having these series of false deadlines that didn't pan out to be right. People that I knew were in quarantine, and I was trying to figure out how to create the best version of church that we could experience while we were also being physically distant. Having to switch automatically to a virtual world when we were very much focused on being an interactive, touchy church, one where we did things in person. But 2 weeks into this rush of adrenaline, and I started to shut down. I didn't want to get up for anything. I remember one morning laying on the bed and just laying there and not wanting to get up. For a minute, I was even wondering if I had caught the virus. I was laying on my bed, not wanting to do a single thing, feeling physically and emotionally exhausted. See, sometimes when we're exhausted, we want to go dormant. We want to put our head in the sand. It's amazing how things that used to be important to us when we're exhausted, suddenly we can just let them go. When we get exhausted, we like to go dormant. But I think that is the exact wrong thing to do. Yes, maybe we need to lay there for a moment to catch our breath. But once we do that, I think it's important that we get up and take part in restorative activities. Not the activities that require us to pour out of ourselves and exhaust us even further. Activities that pour into us and that give us life. Activities of restoration. Activities of health. Activities of life. See, instead of laying in bed, despite everything going on, everything asked of him, despite all the travel that he'd done and all the pain and trauma that he had faced, instead of laying in bed on this morning, Jesus got up early in the morning when it was just him and God, and got moving, got to doing something. And so what did he do? Mark then says he went to a deserted place. A place where he was alone, where no one knew him, where he could breathe, where he could rest, where he could be his own self without the watchful eyes of others. In his great book on James Baldwin titled Begin Again, the Princeton professor Eddie Glaude Jr. titled places like these an elsewhere. An elsewhere. Glaude writes that an elsewhere is that physical or metaphorical place that affords us a place to breathe, to refuse adjustment and accommodation to the demands of society and live apart, if just for a time, from the deadly assumptions that threaten to smother. He says that living elsewhere can offer you a moment of rest, to catch your breath, and to ready yourself to enter into the fray once again. See, and to put this in context, Eddie Glaude was writing about James Baldwin, and he was writing about James Baldwin's experience, especially after April 4th of 1968, after Martin Luther King was assassinated. It was kind of a culmination of assassinations and a culmination of fire that had spread across these United States. And he talks about how James Baldwin found his elsewhere in Istanbul, Turkey. Baldwin spent a lot of time in Paris, but he was well known in Paris. He was famous in Paris. He was famous here in the United States, but not in Istanbul. Istanbul allowed him to live anonymously, and it allowed him to be a place where he could escape, where he could be himself, where he could collect his thoughts, where he could do a lot of his writing, and he could maintain his sense of self before he had to return to the United States. See, but God concludes that we all need to find our own elsewheres. An elsewhere in place, he calls it. He encourages us wherever we are to find a place of rest, a place to breathe, a place to catch our breath, and ready ourselves to enter the fray again. Jesus is creating an elsewhere. He escapes where he is and who he's with to find a place where he can just be. A place that allows him to breathe, to catch his breath, and to ready himself to enter into the fray again. Notice Jesus went to a deserted place, a place with nothing around him, a place so well hidden that a search team couldn't even find him. Mark says that Simon hunted for him. And hunted is a translation of a Greek word that conveys the sense that there was a vigorous search for him. Simon says, everyone is searching for you. When he finally found him, he told Jesus that everyone is searching for you. See, we have to find an elsewhere, a place free from the outside world, a place free from technology, a place free from the demands that life forces upon us. I would go back and I would stress that freedom from technology, because I think our technology nowadays is pulling so much of us, so much out of us that we don't even realize. But we need to find an elsewhere, a place that's free from the demands that life forces upon us. Now, this elsewhere can be anywhere. We don't have to fly off to a different country like James Baldwin did. We can find it right in our homes. Perhaps you know some older people who had a prayer closet, a quiet place where you can shut the door to the outside world and just be with God, talk to God. Maybe it's not a prayer closet. Maybe it's in your living room. Maybe it's in a spare room or a bedroom early in the morning before anyone wakes up. I think, if you ask me, I think the morning time is a very important time because the world is asleep. You're not getting calls, you're not getting emails, you're not getting anything of a distraction. It's a place where you can just be. A time that allows you to just be. Maybe this elsewhere could be a morning walk without your phone. We just have to find a place where we can truly be ourselves, outside of the watchful eyes of others, and just be with ourselves. Just be with God, where it can just be us. We must find a place of rest, a place to breathe, a place to catch our breath and ready ourselves to enter into the fray again. Because no matter what we do, we're going to be pulled upon. We're going to be asked to give. We have to be able to enter into a place where we can just be us. Like Jesus, we need to find an elsewhere. Which brings me to the final aspect of Jesus' example in this Gospel of Mark, in how Jesus faces exhaustion. And the Gospel of Mark finishes this verse by saying, Jesus prayed. He prayed. Jesus consistently entered into a time of prayer with God. Over and over, he goes to a deserted place, a mountain, a garden, somewhere isolated to pray. Oftentimes, it's not for a short period of time. It's for a long duration. It's overnight. It's for a long period of time when Jesus wants to pray. Because see, true prayer is simply a time when we make ourselves open to God. When we become vulnerable with God. When we allow ourselves to sometimes speak what is truly going on in us and with us. what we are feeling and what we are experiencing. I've talked about this before. This is not new. I think we've gotten kind of trained in a bad way by just saying these quick little prayers where we just say words as our prayers, and we don't listen. We don't take time to just open ourselves to God. See, I think even more than words, I think prayer is listening. It's being silent to connect with God. It's allowing God to work in us. It's allowing God to speak to us. But sometimes prayer is expressive. We may not have words, but we have humming and singing. We have moaning, we have shouting, we have dancing, and we have moving. Sometimes we just need to express non-verbally, but express physically to God. Sometimes we just need to get out what we're feeling that we might not have words for. We might need to get out what we're feeling and just give it over to God. Prayer is not one simple thing. Prayer encompasses a whole lot. There are a ton of different practices, a ton of different ways to pray. But you know what you need to do. You know how you need to open to God. Your body knows what it needs to express. Our time in prayer is time for us to be with God however we need to be, however we need to open up. Because when we are truly praying, Richard Rohr says that time in prayer can be an experience of full freedom in God's presence. Full freedom in God's presence. Being in prayer can be a time of spiritual liberation and restoration. Did you hear that? Liberation and restoration. When we're truly praying, we're truly giving ourselves over to God, and we're truly expressing everything that we're experiencing, everything that we're feeling, everything that we're questioning even. Things that are burdening our hearts. When we give those over to God, we can experience full freedom in God's presence, and we can experience a time of spiritual liberation and restoration. Exactly what we need when we're feeling exhausted and burned out and even facing trauma, the trauma that surrounds us. Jesus got up, went to a deserted place, and he prayed. No, I don't need to be worried about Jesus. Jesus built into his life a rhythm of spiritual practice for spiritual care. And I believe it was this practice that sustained him, that gave him the ability to manage the whirlwind of his life, that allowed him to constantly, consistently face the trauma and the pain of his people that was presented to him everywhere he went. I don't need to worry about Jesus. I need to worry about myself. I need to worry about my friends. I need to worry about my community. It's not sacred to pour yourself out so much that you empty and exhaust yourself. That's not holy. That's not what God is asking us to do. God gave us spiritual practices of prayer so that we could recharge ourselves, so that we could refill our cup. And Jesus gave us examples of how to do that. Jesus got up, went to a deserted place, and he prayed. I encourage you to get up. Practice restorative activities that pour into you. Find an elsewhere. And give yourself fully over to God so that you can find liberation and restoration. Amen.